Roshini Rajkumar back with you on Real Talk with Roshini, and my next two guests really only know how to get real. And so I'm so excited to chat with both of them and have you meet them. They've been on the show before, but never together. We're chatting with Reba Dominski. She's Executive Vice President and Chief Social Responsibility Officer for USBank, and Greg Cunningham, Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for the bank. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much, Roshini. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
All right. So I want to start by asking each of you, we're going to talk about how US Bank is rebuilding, is helping to rebuild East Lake Street, North Minneapolis. But first, I thought it really important to share a little bit about your own backgrounds and why this work matters so much. Greg, let's start with you.
You know, Roshini, when I think about the work of driving social change and the work of inclusion and justice and equality, I think back to my childhood, and I think about being a child of the late 60s and early 70s when there were so many small businesses and such a vibrant community built on culture and recreation and community. And for me, you know, I've tried to dedicate my career being a voice and a advocate for social justice and equality in all the work that I've done. And so we all have a responsibility. And I really answer that question, I guess, very succinctly by saying, if not me, then who? And so I fully embrace this opportunity in this moment to leverage my skills and gifts to really give back and serve others.
Reva.
Yeah, you know, I think for both Greg and I would add this work is deeply personal. I was raised by a single mom in Detroit who immigrated from India to the United States when I was 2. My sister was 5. My mom taught my sister and I 2 core values. One was about the importance of education as a pathway out of poverty, education as a pathway to opportunity. The second lesson she taught us was service. So every morning eating my Cheerios, shout out to General Mills, I looked at a poster that hung on the wall. And the poster had a quote by Rabindranath Tagore, and the quote went like this: "I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and found that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy." If you think about it through a biblical lens, Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is required. So for me, service is a calling, and it does bring me immense joy. I'm a really happy person most days, and that's because I get to do this work of service to others. And I do it in corporate America because I truly believe that corporations have some of the most valuable resources, both human and financial, to help make forward progress on some of the most intractable problems in our communities. So that's what brings me to this work and to this moment.
Wow. Well, you two are so inspirational. You inspire me, both of you. Greg, it's so important that you and Reba have a seat at the table in the C-suite at US Bank, which is a company that employs more than 70,000 people. So you have a lot to say in how the rest of the leadership and the rest of the bank reacts. So when the events of May 25th happened and the following aftermath, the protests, the riots, the destruction, how do you wear that, you know, that hat as a Black man who is in pain for members of his community and that community at large, but then you also need to advise the bank's leadership on how to react?
Listen, Roshini, I got to be honest with you. It's an easy burden for me. I think about, all of those who came before me. I think of Mary McLeod Bethune, and I'm thinking about Nat Turner, and I'm thinking about Frederick Douglass. I'm thinking of so many others and what others have sacrificed in that moment. I don't have time to be tired or exhausted or even to be thinking about myself in that moment. Obviously George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day, and that Tuesday morning I was on the phone with our CEO, who, by the way, called me. And we started talking about, what our community response would be. And even more so than that, is what his personal response would be. And the conversation was more, it wasn't a conversation between the chief executive officer and the chief diversity officer. It was a conversation between Andy and Greg. And we were two first names, and we were two men having a conversation about what we could do individually and how to leverage the resources of the organization. And so I look at it as a really uneasy burden, an easy burden, honestly, when I consider all that has come before and what others have done to lay this path. I never view it as an obligation. Whatever this moment requires of me, I'm here to meet it.
Reba, I love how Greg said it was a conversation between Andy and Greg, two men. How can not only the bank employees, but people listening today, how can they look at these conversations we need to have moving forward as a conversation between two people, two neighbors, two coworkers, and not look at the color of skin?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we're seeing this uprising happening across, our Twin Cities community, across the country, really across the globe. And it's hard sometimes to be optimistic when you continue to see the shootings, when you see some of the violence. It's hard sometimes to see a path forward. But I'm actually really optimistic because of the conversations I'm having with individuals, whether that's a response to a social media post where I post that I'm reading this incredible book called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And I am like, waking up and I have new words to use and I have data, or watching the Netflix documentary 13th to understand the 13th Amendment, and kind of the history of Black America. There are so many ways to educate yourself and engage in the conversation. And my husband and I had our first meal out last night, and we happened to run into two friends, both white, affluent, and they were talking to us, and the husband said, I'm reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and his wife said, Reba, I saw your post, and I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we had this incredible dialogue. So whatever your go-to is, if it's books, if it's movies, if it's asking a friend, if it's opening the dialogue, go there, and go there with humility, and go there with vulnerability, and think about the person that you're asking the question of. I think for so many of us, we instantly want to turn to our Black friends and say, hey, Greg, help me process my privilege. Help me understand your experience as an African-American man. And we have to be really thoughtful about that, because for so many of our Black brothers and sisters, they're experiencing this and experiencing a level of trauma that we have to be so thoughtful about. So you can ask, but maybe go in and say, is this something you're comfortable talking about? Is now a good time? Just open the dialogue, and open it, if you don't know what to say, by saying, I don't know what to say, but I want to learn. And I think, Greg, you have a really good quote. I cannot remember it off the top of my head, but you have a really good quote that you use when people come to you and are uncomfortable about engaging in the dialogue.
Well, I'm glad you said, it's, as a Black male, like, I'm not interested in taking on anybody else's burden. And, what's important when people ask me what they can do is I tell them it's not important that you understand what it means to be Black in this country, but it's important that you want to understand, right? It's important that you want to, and that you're willing to do the work. You're willing to examine your own life and your own privilege to try to understand. That's all I can ask.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple, but it really is a good guide, Greg. And on that note, I know you have helped, and Reba has helped USBank as an entity get your feet wet and your hands dirty and your money where your mouth is. Tell us what the bank is doing to help Minneapolis rebuild.
Well, I can start, Greg, and then maybe you can build. So we knew that we needed to act in response to the death of George Floyd, the civil unrest, our conversations with our employees, the uprising that's happening across the globe. And we were seeing a lot of pledges, but what mattered the most to us and to our CEO, Andy Cesare, was that we took action and that we balanced the immediate needs of our communities with a sustained commitment to long-term systems change. So we announced a series of immediate actions, including rebuilding in Minneapolis, where our bank branches were destroyed, presence on Lake Street and also the city's north side. We will help rebuild and reinvest in affordable housing and retail commercial businesses in the impacted area. Bottom line, Roshini, we are not turning away from those communities when they need us the most. We also are going to provide $100 million annually in additional capital to African-American owned and led businesses and organizations. We've established a $15 million fund to award community grants dedicated to addressing systemic economic and racial inequities. We're launching $1 million Community Development Financial Institution, or CDFI, partnership program to give grants and commercial loans to organizations that qualify. And as always, one of the things in this situation that has impressed me the most is how our employees want to engage. So we've provided an additional 8 hours of paid time, of volunteer time for our employees to support their community's recovery efforts over the next 2 months. We've extended doubling our matching gifts program. We did that in response to COVID, and we're extending that increase in matching gifts. We also have an internal site for employees to share how they're giving their time and their money to organizations doing good work in communities, because all of these opportunities are just popping up. You know, there's not an organization that's managing all of the volunteer and all the donation opportunities across impacted communities. So we thought, let's empower our own employees to build that network for themselves. And they are stepping up and giving and serving in record numbers. And Greg, I know there's a couple of other things that you're especially passionate about in both business and talent that I'm hoping that you'll talk about in terms of the commitments we recently made.
Yeah, a couple of those things, you know, I talked about it in a statement or article I released last week as well, that, you know, every company can do more to advance African-American leadership in its organization. Corporate America has basically failed in its attempt to deliver on its promise of inclusion. And so we're making progress, but we certainly have a long way to go. And so one of the things we've done is evolved our talent management and our talent strategy to be much more intentional about advancing, growing, and developing Black leadership in our organization. The other part of it, Reba touched on briefly, is our $100 million annual commitment to Black-owned businesses. I firmly believe that one of the most critical pieces of this work and the system change that needs to happen, there's a phrase that some people are fond of using, saying the best social program is a job. Well, I honestly believe the better way of saying that is the best social program is creating a business that creates a job. And we've got to get back to supporting small businesses, Black-owned businesses, so they can grow and sustain and scale and create jobs, so we can create vibrant communities, so that we can begin to cycle dollars through our communities again, and stop letting these dollars leave our communities. And so I'm really focused and committed to this notion of redoubling the number of African-American owned businesses that we do business with, in addition to the annual commitment that Reba talked about. So those are just a couple of builds on what we've shared, but I think really critical pieces. And maybe the third piece is using our platforms as leaders, everyone in the organization, up and down the organization, as being a vocal advocate for inclusion and system change, both inside our organization and in our communities.
And Greg, from what you're saying, what Reba is saying, it doesn't have to be this monumental step. I mean, each of us individually has the power to show some grace, to say, hey, do you know, to a small business owner, hey, USBank is doing this. Let's go apply for this money, or let's try to get this grant. So it doesn't have to be a colossal undertaking.
No, I think we all just have to be committed to, as Dr. King said, be committed to what we put on paper. We all love this country deeply. And we have a commitment to liberty and justice for all. And so let's make that true and for all. And as an organization, USBank is committed to driving human potential. And what I love about my job is there's no ambiguity in my job. Our purpose is to drive human potential. We use banking as a vessel to deliver that. My job is to ensure that that statement is true for everybody. And so individually, I just ask us all to commit to what we all believe in, and, take individual responsibility for our behaviors, our decisions, and our willingness to serve things greater than ourselves.
Well, so much that both Reba Dominski and Greg Cunningham from USBank have given us to talk about today. And I just want each of you to take 10 seconds. Reba, we'll start with you. What is your hope as we move forward? If you just have 10 seconds to inspire everyone listening today, that first step that each person can take.
Yeah, my hope is that we don't emerge from COVID or our current uprising around social justice unchanged. I hope that every person every day finds one thing that they can do differently. If that's a conversation you're going to have with a friend, if that's calling someone on a racist comment, if that's delivering food to your local pantry, it is those simple, small acts that add up to the kind of change I think we need to see.
And Greg, we'll let you have the final word on this.
Well, I just hope everybody will commit themselves to a life of empathy, is trying to see the world through the lens of others.
I think that's great. Very well said. They are Greg Cunningham, Chief Diversity Officer for USBank, and Reba Dominski, Chief Social Responsibility Officer for USBank. And you can look into those funds on USBank's website. They're also on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you both for having this great conversation with us today.
Thank you, Roshini.
Thanks, Roshini.